Thank you very much. I'd like to thank OAS and UNHCR for giving me the opportunity to speak at this event. It's nice when the English-speaking Caribbean can be represented and be included, since the problem of asylees and refugees are hitting the Caribbean, and it's a problem that we now have to address. So I'd like to talk about Trinidad and Tobago in particular, and put Trinidad and Tobago into a context, because Trinidad and Tobago is seeing the largest amount of refugees coming into the Caribbean. And for a small island state, what is the attraction for refugees and asylum seekers? Trinidad and Tobago are the two most southerly isles in the Caribbean. And Trinidad in particular sits at the closest point 7 nautical miles off the coast of Venezuela. And our geographical location brings with it a number of issues. A lot of human smuggling, an increase in human trafficking, apart from other ills that will come with those two activities. We're also a hub for regional travel. We see at least 40 international flights a day, with at least 12 to 15 of them into the United States alone. And there are others going to Canada, to Panama, to Venezuela, Guyana, and to Europe. So there's easy access to Trinidad and Tobago in terms of those persons who want to fly into the country. What else is attractive is the fact that Trinidad and Tobago is the most industrialized country in the Caribbean. We have oil and gas, which is what our economy is based on. In addition to which, we have a lot of manufacturing sectors and downstream petroleum industries. We have a boom in construction, and because it's two islands and it's two different types of islands, Trinidad being the more industrialized, Tobago being the more tourist-oriented, and there's a lot of ecotourism going on in Trinidad and in Tobago. What else? We are a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Trinidad was first colonized by Spain. We had both Portuguese and French influences, and Dutch. We were then colonized by the British. We had slaves, and after the slaves were freed, we had indentured laborers from India. We had laborers coming from China. And we had a significant population coming in from Syria and Lebanon. So there's a huge diaspora of persons in Trinidad and Tobago. We celebrate all of the festivals, all of the different religions, so that persons coming into Trinidad and Tobago can find themselves a place in our society. They can worship, they look like other people in Trinidad and Tobago. There's a huge diaspora. There are people who speak their language. So it's easy for them sometimes to fit in. So, what do we do about protecting vulnerable migrants? Trinidad and Tobago has seen over the years a lot of persons within the mixed migration flow, a lot of vulnerable persons coming in need of protection. One of the things that we saw over the years was an increase in persons being trafficked to Trinidad and Tobago. And that was dealt with beginning in 2011 when we passed or enacted the Trafficking in Persons Act. And we then implemented a counter-trafficking unit. And since the implementation of the counter-trafficking unit, we've identified and assisted at least 24 victims of trafficking, with at least 15 alleged traffickers being prosecuted. So we've kind of taken that vulnerable population, those victims of trafficking, into consideration, and we have put in place measures to deal with victims of trafficking. When it comes to refugees, that's a different story. Trinidad and Tobago became a signatory to the convention in November of 2000. And after 2000, we saw 1 or 2 persons coming in, and the government of Trinidad and Tobago didn't really see it as a problem at the time. The system that we have in place now, since then to now, is that the UNHCR and their implementation partner, the Living Waters Community, which is an NGO, would receive the applications. As Living Waters Community would receive the applications for asylum. UNHCR would then send a mission down into Trinidad and Tobago and do a refugee status determination, following which that person, if they're recognized, kind of remain in Trinidad and hopefully would be resettled to somewhere else. And that's because the government did not put in place any mechanism to deal with the issue of refugees and asylum seekers. So those persons remained at large, sometimes in Trinidad and Tobago, without any status whatsoever, without any benefits, and essentially would be assisted by UNHCR or their diaspora once they remain in the country. Government, over the years, has been reluctant to deal with the issue because there's this fear in Trinidad and in the Caribbean that if you put some mechanism in place, the refugees will suddenly come to Trinidad and there'll be this flood of refugees coming in. The fact is, in spite of the fact that we have no mechanism, no formal government mechanism to deal with refugees and asylum seekers, they are coming. So that, take for example, in 2013, there was a total of 38 asylum seekers, 8 recognized refugees, and that mixed. And then there was this exponential growth in persons seeking asylum in Trinidad and Tobago. That figure went from 46 to 145. And there's some discrepancies in the figures, because these figures were given to me by Living Waters Community. And I'm seeing a document from UNHCR which said that in 2014 there was 184 persons who were registered as new asylum seekers. And that has been one of the challenges we have encountered in dealing with the issue. But with the statistics that I have, 145 in 2014, 83 asylum seekers, 62 recognized refugees. In 2015, that again increased to 209, 97 asylum seekers, and 112 recognized refugees. And as at the 3rd of March, there were a total of 217 persons of interest, 101 asylum seekers, and 116 recognized refugees in Trinidad and Tobago, who are still without any kind of immigration status and still receive no benefits. If we break that figure down even further, out of the number of persons of concern, there are 137 males, 43 females, 37 children. And of the children, there are 20 males and 17 females. So that's the persons that we are seeing in terms of gender. And then where are these persons coming from? They come from all over the globe. We have refugees or persons seeking asylum from Bangladesh, Colombia, the Ivory Coast, Cuba, Ghana, Haiti, Jamaica. And that's the one that surprised all of us in the Caribbean, because we never thought that another Caribbean country there would be refugees, but there are. Liberia, Mali, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Syria, Uganda, even some from the Ukraine, and more recently from Venezuela. And that poses some measure of concern because of the current situation in Venezuela. So if we look at a map of the world, you can see that persons are coming from every region of the world into Trinidad and Tobago. And that's why I started off with what is attracting people to Trinidad and Tobago. If we look at it case by case, of course the Cubans are the largest population that we see coming in. And they're coming south, of course, and more often than not, they want to go to the US. Because of the numbers that we see coming in, there are a number of persons that cannot be accounted for, and we suspect have what we call spontaneously departed. because we cannot find them anywhere in Trinidad and Tobago, and some of them have been reported to be elsewhere. So, for example, we've had 51 persons who could not be accounted for. Now, what we have tried to put in place at a national level to deal with the issue and working with UNHCR is that persons who are coming in seeking asylum, we put on what is called an order of supervision. That way, they can remain somewhat legally in the country. They do not fall under the Immigration Act because the legislation is not in place to deal with refugees and asylum seekers. There's no domestic legislation, and we have only recently adopted a policy and looking to implement this policy that would lead to the enactment of legislation so that we would be in full compliance. Now, because of the numbers that we're seeing coming in, government of course recognized, listen, we have to put some measure in place to deal with the issue of asylum seekers, because whereas some of them would be resettled to other countries, in 2015 of the numbers that we had, only 19 were resettled to another country. So that leaves quite a significant number of recognized refugees living in Trinidad and Tobago. So government took the decision to develop a policy. And in 2011, UNHCR provided us with a model policy document that we used to fashion our current policy. We took that model policy document and refined it to make it our own. The Ministry of National Security was designated as the lead in establishing a national legal framework and to implement the policy. Between June 2012 and May 2013, we held stakeholder consultations because we wanted to get the inclusion and the buy-in from all of the different stakeholders, the NGOs, law enforcement, other ministry of other arms of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, so that everybody had an input into the policy. That policy, when it was completed, was submitted to Cabinet. And in 2014, June 5th, 2014, the Cabinet approved a phased approach towards the establishment of a national policy to address refugees and asylum seekers in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And what that policy seeks to do is to implement a phased approach. There will be 3 phases to the implementation of the policy and towards government having complete control in refugee status determination. So in phase 1, the current system would apply where UNHCR would continue to lead the refugee status determination, but with more involvement with the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and in particular the Immigration Division. In phase 2, it is expected that government would then lead with the involvement of UNHCR coaching us, helping us along, ensuring that we put proper measures in place. And then by phase 3, government would be conducting their own refugee status determination. And each phase has specific milestones. And it is anticipated that each phase will take no more than 12 months. Bear in mind that the policy was approved in June of 2014, and we are now in March of 2016. So where are we at? In phase 1, what we sought to do was that UNHCR Living Waters community would continue to do the RSD in collaboration with the Immigration Division. And during this first phase, immigration officers would be trained to do the RSDs, as well as some sensitization with other law enforcement officials to appropriately treat with asylum claims. In phase 2, what we're looking to do is that government would focus on establishing the framework to develop the capability for RSDs. So we would develop the whole process, the procedures, in collaboration with UNHCR. And there would be the establishment of an eligibility committee who would then look at the criteria for determining if someone is in fact a refugee. And then by phase 3, government will conduct the RSDs They will have exclusive and sole responsibility for adjudication. All of the procedures for processing the asylum applications will be fully implemented: identification, registration, screening, and whatnot. There would be the establishment of a refugee unit within the Immigration Division. Of course, there would be the enactment of legislation which would then enable the refugees to have certain benefits and to be afforded certain benefits in the country. And there would be ongoing training of officials and public awareness campaigns. So since the policy was approved in 2014, what we decided to do was to develop interim formal standard operating procedures which would guide the actions of the representatives of the Living Waters community and the Immigration Division. So what we did is that we developed scenarios and who would take responsibility and what would take place if a refugee were to apply or an asylum seeker were to arrive at a port of entry, or if the asylum seeker may have come in illegally or come in legally and approach Living Waters community, what would be the responsibility? And what it is that both organizations, the Living Waters community / UNHCR and the Immigration Division, would have the information regarding each person seeking asylum, so that we would begin to build our database and implement a case management system to manage and to track the application. Immigration officers have been trained, and at this juncture I'd like to thank UNHCR and the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, the Asylum Division, for affording immigration officers the opportunity to train with their officers here in the US at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, where the officers had 6 weeks of intense training to address the issue of, or to understand what goes into determining who is a refugee. We also, because the officers had been trained, set up, instead of waiting for phase 3, set up an informal refugee unit, so that that refugee unit would begin to develop, in conjunction with UNHCR, some of the procedures to deal with the applications. We also started the legislative process. The legal drafters are currently drafting legislation to put measures in place, and they're debating whether there should be a whole new act or whether the current Immigration Act should be adapted to include refugees and asylum seekers. But the legal drafters are working that out. What we've also done, because the Caribbean is a chain of small island states, and some countries have not been able to deal with asylum seekers, and in addition to which, and as Simone would tell me several times, that it's difficult to get to some of the other islands. I mentioned earlier that it's easy to get into Trinidad and Tobago, that there would be some kind of transfer mechanism where persons who are recognized as refugees in other small islands would come to Trinidad while awaiting resettlement. And we have been able to facilitate at least 2 of those refugees from other islands. And the other great achievement for us is that UNHCR now has a representative in Trinidad and Tobago to assist the government of Trinidad and Tobago in putting measures in place and to fast track some of the RSD decisions, so that persons would not wait a long time to have their interviews and then to have the decision by UNHCR here in DC. So that's some of the achievements that we've had over the last 2 years, almost 2 years now, since the approval of the policy. What do we do next? And based on the policy that we have and where we want to go, one of the key things is really to create a proper case management system. And we're looking at the system in the US and in other regions to see how they manage asylum seekers. And then when persons are recognized as refugees, what happens to them and how they are either managed or how they are integrated into the society. We are working now on coming up with a mechanism to allow recognized refugees to live and work legally in the country. And we are having discussions with the ministers to see what we can put in place. We had gotten some ways, but then in September of 2015, we had a change in government. So while a lot of these initiatives had started under the former government, we now have to bring the current government up to speed and understand what their position is on the issue of refugees and asylum seekers. Because once we enact legislation, once we draft legislation, this government would now have to debate it in Parliament and all the way up to enactment. So for now, we are looking at working on a way to give them some kind of permit which would allow them to be self-sufficient, and that they would not be afraid of being stopped by either immigration enforcement or other law enforcement officials like the police and have no legal status in the country per se. Then there's the issue of providing them with identity documents. As it stands now, we don't give them anything, and we need to find a mechanism to afford them some identity document, again, to give them some measure of comfort that they would not be stopped and they would not be imprisoned by law enforcement officials. Enactment of the legislation, of course, may take some time, and we're looking to see how far we could get and what we could put in place outside of the legislation so that we can appropriately deal with the issues facing the asylum seekers and the refugees. We need to sensitize the public, and I see this as being something that we need to fast track, because recently there was an article in a newspaper, I think it was in Antigua, where they were saying that 14 refugees are to be resettled to Trinidad and Tobago. And then there was on Facebook a lot of posts and very negative and almost derogatory remarks made about that particular initiative. And there really is need, even though Trinidad is a multicultural and very tolerant society, the unknown as to who and what is a refugee could create some disdain amongst the population, and because of the fact that they are not aware of what a refugee has to go through or what that particular individual would have gone through to get to Trinidad and Tobago. And for the whole morning we've been hearing